So with that, I welcome Dr. Arthur Frank.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to the storytellers. It's a particular honor for me as a non-physician, to be asked to participate in honoring the writers of these stories, and even more in celebrating the impetus of the college in having a short story competition. For me to be part of these awards completes a circle that's been going around for almost exactly 20 years. As Rob said, in 1989, I wrote what became my first book, At the Will of the Body. At the Will tells the story of my own illness experiences in the 1980s when I had a virally induced heart attack, which I'm sort of disturbed that I'm now told has been downgraded in medical lexicon to a cardiac incident. I sort of still think of myself as having had a heart attack. It's disturbing to be downgraded, you know. Just when I was recovering from that, I began to have the symptoms that were diagnosed after some considerable delay as testicular cancer. Soon after I finished treatment for that, my mother-in-law, who had been in and out of remission with breast cancer for about a decade, finally died. At the Will of the Body offers the story of those years as a companion to others who are going through illness. When I found out I had had the heart attack, I was suddenly forced to think of my life and my body in a new way. Because I'm a bibliophile by disposition and profession, I went looking for a book, for somebody else's story that would be a companion to me in what I realized were going to be very strange days ahead. There was not much available 20 years ago. And ultimately, I had to write that book for myself. I believe that we're always telling stories first for ourselves, and then, although then can be a very short period of time, for others. It's slightly inappropriate, but only honest to tell you, that I wrote At the Will with a considerable sense of alienation from medicine. I mean this in the literal sense of the German word from which the English usage derives. Doctors seemed strange to me. And being with doctors made me feel strange to myself. As some part of me watched myself interacting with physicians, I didn't really recognize the person I was in those interactions. He wasn't expressing what I was feeling. But I felt that version of me was acting in response to how he was being treated by individual physicians and by the institutional context from which those physicians were inseparable. I kept asking myself, are doctors acting that way because it's how they choose to act, or because of how they feel they have to act? Shane Nielsen's story raises that issue when he writes, "I am locked into the sentences I have spoken many times before." Dr. Nielsen then questions the advice given by a mentor to say the same things in the same way. That advice no longer works with patients who are, as he says, breaking down in individual ways. Several years after I'd written my book, my alienation was articulated in a posthumous illness narrative by the prominent literary critic Anatole Broyard, who died of prostate cancer. Broyard wrote, or more accurately, he said during grand rounds that he was invited to give at University of Chicago Medical School, "Doctors discourage our stories." And that was my experience exactly. I felt my stories were discouraged. That is what today's forum changes. And that's why I say that today's forum closes a circle that opened back then. Or if not exactly closing it, at least it starts a new loop. What is honored today, and what the award winners represent, is doctors taking seriously their own stories. Not just telling them in the corridors, as Rob said, but making them an institutionalized part of medicine. This is absolutely prerequisite to doctors encouraging their patients' stories. Because I believe there's a simple equation that all of us live within. You cannot respect others' stories unless you respect your own stories. That, to me, is the point of the college's competition, making a professional statement that these stories matter. Medicine is far more than what goes into the chart. Anatole Breuard also recognizes how doctors, in his words, bear the emotional burden of avoiding the patient, which means avoiding the full, extensive story of illness that the patient is living. The scheduling and the floor plans of clinical spaces encourage that avoidance. Clinics are built to choreograph avoidance. The emotional burden that results is really a double burden, because to avoid someone else is to avoid some part of yourself. Today's session, culminating the story writing of many family physicians, is an essential step toward laying down that burden of avoidance. By valuing not only the content of what these stories tell, but also valuing the act of writing about medical experience, doctors move past the avoidance that Breuard spoke of, and that I have heard so many ill people notice with regret, both for themselves as patients and for their physicians. I wrote At the Will of the Body as a means of survival, because I needed to tell that story so that my own life could regain a coherence that illness had disrupted. To narrate is first and foremost to order events in time so that each part of the narrative gains significance with reference to the other parts. Narration is essential to being human, because the world in itself is not ordered. The world in itself is what William James famously called a blooming, buzzing confusion. Whatever order and coherence exist in life has been created by humans. Learning to create order begins with hearing and then telling stories, because to narrate is inherently an act of ordering. Stories order things in time and space, in priority, and in relations between actions and outcomes. A world that we can tell stories about becomes a meaningful place, insofar as outcomes not only have a certain predictability, but also because stories convey a sense that what happened was good or bad. Stories evaluate. When terrible things happen in stories, as they do in the stories we hear this morning, those terrible things at least have a place. They are meaningful in the sense of fitting a pattern. As we humans discern that pattern, we are better able to live with those terrible things. Illness is an occasion for stories. Illness calls for stories because illness disorders. Illness fractures patterns that hold lives together. Telling stories is essential to creating new patterns in which illness now has a place. Over the years that have now become decades, my work on illness experience has given me the opportunity to get to know many doctors. And I've learned that doctors have the same problem that patients have, which is living with the persistence of suffering. In one way, doctors' version of this problem may be easier because their bodies are not yet sick. But in another way, the physician's version of the problem is actually more difficult. And here's my sense of why. Doctors are supposed to reduce suffering to diseases and then be able to fit diseases into coherent patterns. These patterns are called diagnoses and treatments. And they are narrative in the basic form of being, again, arrangements in time and space, in which one thing leads to another. These official narratives of disease and its typical progression are what we call medical knowledge. The problem for doctors as human beings is that these narratives are radically incomplete for living with human suffering and tragedy. There's a funny, ironic, and also very sad line in Andrew Lodge's story when he remarks that he must have missed the class on how to deal with this situation, the situation being a communal outpouring of grief. The line is ironic because we all know there wasn't any such class, and maybe there couldn't have been. But there could have been a class teaching students that someday they would need to stop and write a story. Because if they didn't, then what they believed they had to ignore, because it didn't fit the official medical narrative, that would accumulate inside of them and it would drive them crazy. Or in a different jargon, what they ignored would eventually alienate them from their parents and from themselves. Alienation is when life starts to seem, in Hamlet's phrase, flat, stale, and unprofitable. So over the years, I've learned that Anatole Breuard was only half right. If, as Breuard did say, doctors do not encourage their patients' stories, that is because they too rarely allow themselves to tell their own stories. Because I've learned over the years that storytelling only happens in relationships. To tell a story establishes a relationship, and unless we humans trust that a relationship can be established, we can't tell stories. It's like trying to breathe underwater. To press that metaphor, where once I saw patients drowning, increasingly, now I see all kinds of medical workers drowning. For storytelling to be a relationship, the stories have to get around. Telling these stories here at a professional society meeting and eventually publishing them can be only a first step in that process. As I read these stories, I had a fantasy, which is probably not a good idea to apply literally, but it's useful as what philosophers call a thought experiment. My fantasy was that in doctors' waiting rooms, instead of old magazines and public health brochures, patients might pick up stories that the doctor had written, stories not unlike what we have heard. And maybe patients would then bring in their stories and leave copies of these on the rack next to the doctor's stories. That would open